The jungle was alive with sounds that night. Birds called out to each other, insects buzzed in the thick air, and somewhere in the distance a monkey howled. David wiped the sweat from his forehead and checked his GPS device one more time. He was definitely lost. He'd been working in the Amazon rainforest for 3 weeks now, documenting cases where big companies were pushing into protected lands. As a lawyer who specialized in helping indigenous communities, he'd seen plenty of injustice. But this assignment felt different somehow. The locals in the nearest village had warned him about going too deep into the forest. They spoke in hushed tones about a tribe that lived beyond the mapped territories, people who were different from everyone else. David didn't believe in superstitions. He believed in facts, evidence, and the law. So when his guide suddenly refused to go any further and turned back, David continued alone. Maybe that was his first mistake. The river he'd been following suddenly widened, and that's when he saw them. At first he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. The heat, the humidity, maybe he was dehydrated. But no, they were real. A group of people stood on the opposite bank, and they were unlike anyone he'd ever seen. They were tall, impossibly tall, with skin that seemed to catch the fading sunlight in strange ways. It almost looked like they were glowing, though David told himself that was just the reflection off the water. Their eyes, though, those he couldn't explain away. When they looked at him, their eyes reflected the light like an animal's might at night. For a long moment, nobody moved. David raised his hand slowly in greeting, trying to show he meant no harm. The tallest among them, an elderly woman with silver hair that reached her waist, tilted her head and studied him. Then, without a word, they all melted back into the forest. David made camp that night near the river, his mind racing. He'd found an uncontacted tribe, something that was increasingly rare in the modern world. As a lawyer, he knew the implications. These people had rights, protections under international law. They needed to be documented, protected, kept safe from exploitation. But he also felt something else, a sense that he'd stumbled into something far bigger than a simple legal case. He woke suddenly in the middle of the night to the sound of shouting. Grabbing his flashlight, David ran toward the noise. What he saw made his blood run cold. A group of armed men, at least a dozen of them, were pushing through the forest toward a cluster of simple dwellings he hadn't noticed before. The tribe's village. The miners, they had to be miners, carried weapons and flashlights. David had heard about these illegal operations. They came in the night, drove people off their land, and destroyed everything in their path looking for gold, minerals, or whatever else they could sell. Without thinking, David ran forward and planted himself between the miners and the village. "Stop, you can't do this. This is protected land." The leader of the group, a stocky man with a scar across his cheek, laughed. "And who's going to stop us, you?" "The law will stop you," David said, though his voice shook. "I'm documenting everything. I have evidence, recordings, photos. You touch these people and you'll face international charges." It was mostly a bluff. His phone was back at his camp. But he stood his ground, arms spread wide, even as the miners advanced. Behind him, he could hear movement as the tribe's families gathered, watching this stranger defend them. The scarred man stepped forward and hit David hard across the face. David fell but scrambled back to his feet, positioning himself in front of the villagers again. "You'll have to go through me," he said, tasting blood. They beat him. David wasn't a fighter, and he knew he couldn't win. But he could slow them down. Every minute he kept them busy was a minute the tribe had to escape or hide. He curled up, his boots connected with his ribs, his back, his legs. He thought about calling for help, but his phone was too far away. Then he heard it. The sound of helicopter blades cutting through the night air. Bright lights flooded the area, and a voice boomed through a loudspeaker in Portuguese. The environmental police had arrived. Someone from the nearby village must have reported the miners' movement. The miners scattered like rats, disappearing into the jungle. David lay on the ground, every part of his body screaming in pain. Through blurred vision, he saw the elderly woman from earlier approaching. She knelt beside him, her strange eyes filled with something that looked like wonder. She placed a cool hand on his forehead and spoke in a language he'd never heard. Other tribe members gathered around, their faces a mixture of curiosity and gratitude. They lifted him carefully and carried him into their village. The next few days passed in a haze. David drifted in and out of consciousness as the tribe treated his injuries. They used medicines he'd never seen before, poultices made from jungle plants that seemed to heal his wounds impossibly fast. When he finally woke fully, 4 days had passed. The elderly woman was sitting beside him. Through gestures and drawings in the dirt, she introduced herself. Her name sounded like Yara to his ears. She pointed to herself, then to the sky, then made a sweeping gesture that seemed to encompass her entire tribe. David's mind struggled to process what she seemed to be suggesting. From the sky? That was impossible. But then again, everything about these people was impossible. Their height, their eyes, the way their skin seemed to shimmer. The medicines that had healed him in days when he should have needed weeks. Over the following days, as his strength returned, David observed the tribe. They were peaceful, gentle with each other and with him. Children played games that looked almost normal, except for the way they moved with an uncanny grace. The adults worked together, their community functioning with a harmony he'd rarely seen, but he also noticed their fear. They watched the jungle's edge constantly. They spoke in worried tones while looking at the sky. Something had them frightened, and David suspected it was more than just the miners. One evening, Yara brought him to the edge of the village where 3 younger women waited. She introduced them with great ceremony, as if presenting people of high importance. The first, who appeared to be in her late 20s, had long, dark hair woven with flowers. The second, slightly older, wore what looked like ceremonial markings on her arms. The third, the oldest of the 3, had an air of authority that reminded him of successful businesswomen he'd known. Yara spoke at length, and though David couldn't understand the words, he understood the meaning. These 3 women would be his guides, his teachers, his connection to the tribe. The youngest approached him with a bowl of some kind of tea. When he drank it, he felt his remaining pain fade even more. The middle one showed him star charts drawn on bark, pointing to constellations and then to the tribe. The oldest simply studied him with intelligent eyes, as if measuring his worth. That night, David made a decision. These people, whoever or whatever they truly were, deserved protection. They deserved to live in peace, and he was going to make sure they got it, no matter what it cost him. He didn't know then that this decision would change his entire life. He didn't know about the battles ahead, the sacrifices he'd have to make, or the incredible gift the tribe would eventually offer him. All he knew was that he'd stumbled into something extraordinary, and walking away was not an option. The jungle sounds continued around them, but for the first time since arriving in the Amazon, David felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. 3 weeks later, David sat in the tribe's relocated village, deep in a part of the jungle that even the locals said was unreachable. The environmental police had helped them move after the miner attack, but David knew it was only a temporary solution. Sooner or later, the mining company would find them again. Yara had finally decided to trust him with the truth. She led him to a hidden chamber beneath the largest tree in the village, a space that seemed to have been carved from living wood. The walls glowed with a soft blue light that came from no source David could identify. Inside that chamber, Yara showed him things that should not exist. Crystalline devices that hummed with energy. Books, if you could call them that, made from some material that felt like silk but was stronger than steel. Images that moved like videos but floated in the air without any screen or projector. Through a combination of gestures, drawings, and the help of one of the 3 women who seemed to understand Portuguese better than the others, Yara told him their story. Her people had come to Earth hundreds of years ago, long before Europeans reached the Americas. They'd been travelers, explorers from somewhere beyond the stars, and their ship had failed them. Stranded on Earth, they'd hidden themselves in the deepest jungles, places where humans rarely went. They'd lived quietly, keeping their technology hidden, raising their families, and hoping one day their people might return for them. But centuries passed and no rescue came. Eventually, they accepted that Earth was their home now. David listened, his scientific mind warring with what he was seeing and hearing. Part of him wanted to dismiss it as fantasy, but the evidence was right in front of him. These devices, this technology, it was real, and more importantly, the danger these people faced was real. Yara explained that the mining company wasn't just looking for gold. Somehow, they'd detected unusual mineral signatures in this area. The company didn't know about the tribe's true nature, but they suspected there was something valuable hidden in the jungle. If they ever discovered the truth, if they found the tribe's technology, it would be catastrophic. The youngest of the 3 women, whose name sounded like Amara, stepped forward. She held a small crystal that glowed with inner light. With Yara's help translating, She explained that this was a medical device, something that could diagnose and treat diseases with incredible precision. Their people didn't get sick the way humans did. They lived longer, healed faster, and understood the body in ways human doctors were only beginning to grasp. She placed the crystal against David's chest, and he felt a warm, tingling sensation. Images appeared in the air, showing his body in perfect detail. She pointed to an old injury in his shoulder, something from a car accident years ago that still bothered him sometimes. The crystal pulsed, and suddenly the chronic pain he'd learned to ignore simply vanished. The second woman, Sina, showed him their agricultural techniques. They could grow crops in soil that should be infertile. They could produce harvests in half the time it took conventional farming. They understood the jungle in ways that seemed almost magical. Though David was beginning to understand it was actually advanced science, just science beyond human understanding. The third woman, Kira, was different. While the others showed him technology and knowledge, she showed him maps and documents. Not ancient ones, but recent ones. She'd been watching the mining company, tracking their movements, understanding their plans. She had a strategic mind that immediately impressed David. Through broken Portuguese and hand gestures, Kira explained that the company was planning a major operation. They'd secured permits through corruption and bribery. They had government officials in their pocket. In 3 months, maybe less, they'd begin tearing up this entire region of the jungle. David's legal mind kicked into gear. "We need to fight them in court," he said. "We need injunctions, environmental impact studies, indigenous rights claims." Kira nodded, understanding. But then she pointed to her people, and David understood the problem. If the tribe appeared in court, if their existence became public knowledge, the media frenzy would be unstoppable. Scientists, militaries, corporations, they'd all descend on this place. The tribe would go from hidden to the most studied people on Earth overnight. Yara spoke again, and her meaning was clear. They needed David to be their voice in the human world. They needed him to fight battles they couldn't fight themselves in courtrooms and government offices, places where their appearance would cause more problems than solutions. David ran his hands through his hair, thinking. This was bigger than any case he'd ever handled. He'd need resources, money, time. He'd probably lose his job when he stopped showing up at the office. His reputation would suffer if he couldn't explain where he'd been or what he was doing. But looking around at these people, these peaceful beings who just wanted to live quietly, who'd been kind to him when they could have just let the miners have him, David knew he didn't have a choice. "I'll do it," he said. "I'll protect you." Yara smiled, and for the first time David saw her people truly relax. The 3 women exchanged glances, and something passed between them that he couldn't read. Over the next few weeks, David began preparing his legal strategy. Sina worked with him, helping him understand the tribe's history and their claim to the land. She was incredibly intelligent, able to grasp complex legal concepts even though they were so foreign to her culture. She'd sit with him for hours, translating ancient tribal records into something he could use in court. Amara took care of his health. The stress of what he was planning was already taking its toll, and she seemed to sense when he needed rest or medicine. She taught him meditation techniques that her people used, ways of calming the mind that were far more effective than anything he'd learned. Kira became his strategic partner. She understood power and politics in ways that surprised him. She helped him identify which government officials might be sympathetic, which environmental groups could be allies, which journalists might tell the story without sensationalizing it. The 3 women became his constant companions, his team, his support system. He found himself looking forward to his planning sessions with Sina, appreciating Amara's gentle care when he was exhausted, and respecting Kira's sharp insights into human nature. Late one night, as he sat going over documents by lamplight, all 3 women joined him. They brought food, tea, and their company. For hours they worked together. And David realized something that both excited and frightened him. He was developing feelings for all 3 of them. Not the same feelings, each was unique. Sina challenged his mind and made him think differently. Amara's compassion touched something deep in his heart. Kira's strength made him want to be better, stronger, more capable. It was confusing and completely inappropriate, he told himself. He was here to help them, not to develop romantic feelings. Besides, relationships were complicated enough with one person. What he was feeling didn't make sense, but the feelings were there, growing stronger every day. As the women said goodnight and left him to his work, David stared at the legal documents in front of him. He'd come to the Amazon to do a job. Now he was preparing to fight the biggest case of his life, for people who shouldn't exist, while falling for 3 women who were way out of his league in every possible way. His old life felt very far away, and somehow that didn't bother him as much as it should have. The next 8 months were the hardest of David's life. He'd returned to civilization with a briefcase full of carefully prepared documents and a mind full of secrets he couldn't share with anyone. His first stop was the Brazilian federal court in Brasilia. He filed an emergency injunction to halt all mining operations in the protected territory. The mining company's lawyers showed up in force, expensive suits and confident smiles, certain they'd crush this nobody lawyer who was working alone. They didn't know who they were dealing with. David had something they didn't have. He had the truth, or at least as much of it as he could reveal, and he had evidence of environmental violations that couldn't be ignored. But winning one battle didn't mean winning the war. The mining company fought back hard. They filed countersuits claiming David was interfering with legitimate business operations. They dug into his background looking for anything they could use against him. They even tried to have him disbarred, claiming he was representing a client that didn't legally exist. That last one was tricky. How do you prove your clients exist without revealing who and what they really are? David solved it by working with the environmental police who'd witnessed the tribe's village. He got testimony from local indigenous advocacy groups. He built a case around the principle that uncontacted tribes had rights even if they chose not to participate directly in legal proceedings. His colleagues back home thought he'd lost his mind. His boss at the NGO called him personally. "David, what are you doing? You were supposed to document land rights violations, not start a one-man crusade against one of the biggest mining corporations in South America." David couldn't explain. How could he tell them about Yara's people, about technology that shouldn't exist, about the 3 women who sent him messages through encrypted channels, providing him with evidence and encouragement? His funding dried up. The NGO couldn't support his case without understanding what he was really fighting for. David maxed out his credit cards, hiring local lawyers to help with the Portuguese legal system. He lived in cheap hotels, ate cheap food, and spent every waking hour preparing arguments and gathering evidence. The mining company wasn't just fighting him in court. They started a smear campaign, telling reporters that David was a fraud, that he was being paid by rival mining interests, that he'd invented stories about a tribe that didn't exist. Some news outlets ran with it, painting him as either a liar or a lunatic. There were dark moments when David wondered if he was fighting a losing battle. Late at night, alone in his hotel room, he'd stare at the ceiling and wonder if he should just give up, go home, return to his normal life. Then his phone would buzz with an encrypted message from Sina, sharing a new piece of evidence she'd uncovered. Or Amara would send him herbal remedies through a complex network of local contacts, things that would help with his stress headaches and sleepless nights. Or Kira would provide strategic advice that would help him outmaneuver the mining company's next move. Whenever he could, David returned to the jungle. The tribe had become his refuge, the one place where he didn't have to pretend or hide his exhaustion. Yara would greet him like a returning son, and the 3 women would sit with him around the fire, listening to his stories of courtroom battles and legal maneuvering. During these visits, David's relationship with the 3 women deepened. He'd have long conversations with Sina about philosophy and science. She'd show him more of her people's knowledge, and they'd discuss how some of it might eventually be shared with humanity, in ways that wouldn't cause chaos. She made him laugh with her observations about human society, seeing things from an outsider's perspective that were both insightful and hilarious. Amara taught him about healing, not just physical but emotional. She had a way of seeing through his defenses, of knowing when he was pushing himself too hard. She'd sit with him in comfortable silence or walk with him through the jungle, pointing out plants and animals and sharing stories about her people's connection to the natural world. Kira became his intellectual equal and sparring partner. They'd spend hours debating strategy, playing out scenarios, anticipating the mining company's moves. She had a brilliant mind for tactics, and David found himself relying on her insights more and more. She challenged him, pushed him to think bigger and bolder. He was falling in love with all 3 of them, and it terrified him. How could this possibly work? Even if he won the legal case, even if he protected the tribe, what future could they have together? He was human, they were not entirely. He came from a world of cities and technology. They lived in the jungle, and there were 3 of them. His culture didn't have room for what he was feeling, but every time he tried to push these feelings away, one of them would do something that made his heart ache. Sina's bright laugh when he explained some absurdity of human law, Amara's gentle touch when she treated a cut on his hand, Kira's fierce pride when he won a victory in court. The legal battle reached its climax in the 8th month. The case had been elevated to the Brazilian Supreme Court, the highest level possible. David stood before the justices presenting his final arguments. He spoke of indigenous rights, of environmental protection, of the need to preserve places in the world where mystery could still exist. He couldn't tell them about the tribe's true origin. He couldn't show them the technology, or explain why these particular people were so important, but he could argue for their right to exist in peace, for the protection of their land, for the preservation of one of Earth's last truly isolated communities. The mining company's lawyers argued about economic development, jobs, progress, and national interests. They painted David as a foreign interference, as someone who didn't understand Brazil's needs. The court took 2 weeks to decide. 2 weeks where David barely slept, pacing his hotel room waiting for news. The 3 women sent him daily messages of support, but they were as nervous as he was. If he lost this case, their people would have to flee deeper into the jungle, and there was nowhere left to run. Finally, the decision came. David stood in the courtroom, his hands shaking as the Chief Justice read the ruling. The court sided with the tribe. The mining operations were permanently banned from the protected territory. The indigenous people's rights were affirmed, and additional protections were put in place to prevent future encroachment. David had won. Against all odds, with no funding and no support, he'd won. He stumbled out of the courthouse into the bright Brasilia sunlight, hardly believing it. His phone immediately buzzed with messages. The 3 women all sending the same thing. Come home. Celebrate with us home. When had he started thinking of the jungle village as home? When had these extraordinary people become his family? David booked a flight back to the Amazon that same day. As the plane flew over the endless green canopy, he realized that winning the case was only the beginning. Now he had to figure out what came next, for the tribe, for the 3 women, and for himself. He had a feeling that conversation was going to be even more challenging than any courtroom battle. The celebration in the village lasted 3 days. The tribe held ceremonies David didn't fully understand, with chanting and dancing under the stars that seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as their voices. They treated him like a hero, which made him uncomfortable. He'd only done what was right. On the 4th night, Yara asked him to come to the ceremonial chamber beneath the great tree. The entire tribe gathered, forming a circle around the glowing space. The 3 women, Amara, Sina, and Kira, stood beside Yara, dressed in ceremonial garments that shimmered like starlight. Yara spoke in her language, her voice carrying weight and formality. Even without understanding every word, David grasped that something important was happening. She gestured to him, then to the sky, then made sweeping motions that seemed to encompass the entire tribe. Others in the circle nodded and murmured agreement. Then Yara said something that made the 3 women step forward. They stood before David, and for the first time since he'd known them, all 3 looked nervous. Sina took a deep breath and spoke in careful Portuguese. David, our people have a tradition. When someone saves the tribe from destruction, when someone sacrifices everything for our survival, we offer them our greatest treasure, not gold or technology, but something far more valuable. Our bonds, our family, our future, Amara continued, her gentle voice barely above a whisper. Yara has decreed that you should be adopted into our tribe as a full member. You've earned that right through your courage and dedication. Kira finished, her strong voice clear and certain. But we, the 3 of us, wish to offer you something more. In our culture, when a hero saves the tribe, our most accomplished members offer themselves as life partners. If you'll have us, David's mind went blank. He stared at the 3 women, then at Yara, then back at the women. I don't understand. You mean all 3 of you? Together? Sina nodded. In our culture, family structures are different from what you're used to. We believe that love multiplies rather than divides. Multiple partners strengthen bonds rather than weaken them. The 3 of us have discussed this, and we each wish to explore a future with you together. But why? David asked, his voice cracking. I'm just a lawyer who did his job. You three are incredible. You're healers and scholars and strategists. You could have anyone, Amara smiled softly. We don't want anyone. During these months of working together, of fighting together, we've come to care for you, each of us in our own way. Kira added, I admire your strength and your principles. You never wavered, even when it cost you everything. That's the kind of partner I want. Sena said, you respect our knowledge and our ways. You see us as equals, not as exotic curiosities. You make me laugh and think and feel understood. Amara concluded, you have a good heart. You care deeply. You heal others through your actions, and you've shown us compassion even when you didn't understand us. David felt overwhelmed. I need to be honest with you. I've been developing feelings for all three of you. It's been confusing and inappropriate, and I didn't know what to do about it. I thought I was going crazy. You're not crazy, Kira said firmly. You're just experiencing something your culture doesn't prepare you for. But feelings don't have to fit into neat boxes. This is a lot, David said, running his hands through his hair. I need time to think. This is so far outside anything I've ever experienced. Yara spoke again, and Sena translated. She says you can have all the time you need. This is not an obligation or a debt to be paid. This is an offer freely given and freely chosen by all parties. If you decline, you're still family to us. If you accept, we begin a journey together. The tribe dispersed, leaving David alone with the three women. They sat together by the fire, and for the first time, the conversation turned personal in ways it hadn't before. Tell me honestly, David said, is this really what you want, or is this about tradition and obligation? Amara answered first. I've watched you push yourself to exhaustion for people you barely knew. I've seen you wake up from nightmares about losing the case. I've held your hand when you were sick from stress. Those weren't the actions of a lawyer doing his job. Those were the actions of someone who genuinely cares. And I fell in love with that man. Sena leaned forward. You treat me like an intellectual equal. Do you know how rare that is? Most people see me as exotic or other. You see me as Sena, as a person, as a mind worth engaging with. When we talk late into the night about science and philosophy, I feel more alive than I ever have. I don't want to lose that. Kira, always the most direct, said, I respect you. That's not something I give easily. You're strategic, clever, and you don't back down when you believe in something. I want a partner who challenges me, who stands beside me rather than behind or ahead. That's you. David felt tears prick his eyes. What about the practical aspects? I still have a life outside the jungle. I have family, a career, a world I come from. How would this even work? We've thought about that, Kira said. We're not asking you to abandon your world. We're asking you to help us bridge ours with yours. We could build a home at the edge of the territory, somewhere between the village and civilization. You could continue your work and we could be together. My culture doesn't accept polyamorous relationships easily, David said. People will judge, will gossip, will make assumptions. Then they're not people worth caring about, Sena said simply. Anyone who loves you will want you to be happy regardless of how that happiness looks. David spent the next 2 weeks thinking. He walked through the jungle alone, he talked with Yara. He even called his mother from the village's satellite phone and had a very awkward conversation about relationships and cultural differences. His mother, to her credit, listened without judgment. David, she finally said, you've always been different. You've always seen the world in your own way. If these women make you happy, if they respect and love you, then what does it matter what anyone else thinks? Life is too short to live by other people's rules. He spent time with each woman individually. Long walks with Amara where they barely spoke but felt completely connected. Intense discussions with Sena about everything from quantum physics to poetry. Strategic planning sessions with Kira that turned into debates about philosophy and purpose. And he realized something fundamental. He wasn't being asked to choose between them. He was being offered the chance to love all three in different ways with different strengths. Amara filled his need for emotional connection and nurturing. Sena challenged his mind and fed his curiosity. Kira matched his ambition and drive. Together they were more than the sum of their parts. And with them he felt more complete than he'd ever felt alone. Finally, he made his decision. He gathered the three women and Yara in the ceremonial chamber. I'm terrified, he admitted. I don't know if I can do this right. I'm going to make mistakes. I'm from a different world with different expectations. But I want to try. I want to build this life with you, all three of you, if you'll be patient with me while I learn." The joy on their faces made every fear worth it. Yara performed a ceremony that night, binding them together in the tribe's traditions. It wasn't a legal marriage, at least not in any way David's world would recognize. But it was real, and it was binding in ways that mattered more than paperwork. They spent the next month planning their future. Kira helped David design a house that would sit at the territory's edge. Sina worked with him to establish a foundation that would protect the tribe's interests. Amara taught him more about her people's ways, preparing him for a life lived between two worlds. And slowly, David learned to navigate the complexity of loving three people. He learned that each relationship needed its own time and attention. He learned to communicate openly about needs and feelings. He learned that jealousy was less about love and more about fear, and that fear could be addressed with honesty and reassurance. The three women, for their part, welcomed him into their existing bonds. They'd been friends for years, sisters in spirit if not in blood. Adding David to that dynamic strengthened rather than divided them. They supported each other, celebrated each other's unique connections with him, and built something that none of them had expected, but all of them cherished. It wasn't always easy. There were misunderstandings and hurt feelings and moments of doubt, but they worked through them together, with patience and love and commitment. David's old life felt like it belonged to someone else. The man who'd arrived in the Amazon months ago had been transformed by the jungle, by the case, and by three extraordinary women who'd seen something in him worth loving. 6 months after accepting the women's offer, David stood in the house they'd built together. It was a remarkable structure, blending modern architecture with the tribe's technology in ways that shouldn't work but somehow did. Solar panels powered the electricity, but crystals from the tribe's stores provided backup power and heating. The walls were made from sustainable jungle materials, but reinforced with techniques that made them stronger than concrete. From the porch, David could see both the jungle stretching endlessly in one direction and the distant signs of civilization in the other. It was the perfect symbol of his new life existing between two worlds. The household had settled into comfortable routines. Amara tended a garden where she grew both earth plants and specimens from her people's original world. Carefully preserved through centuries, she'd begun documenting her medical knowledge with David's help, creating a database that might someday, very carefully, be shared with human doctors. Sina had converted one room into a study filled with books, tablets, and screens. She'd taken to learning everything she could about human culture and science, fascinated by how humans had developed technology along such different paths from her people. She and David spent evenings in deep discussion, bridging two worlds of knowledge. Kira managed their external affairs, handling the continued legal battles and political maneuvering necessary to keep the tribe protected. She'd proven to have a gift for dealing with bureaucracy, understanding human power structures in ways that amazed David. Together, they'd established the foundation that now funded conservation efforts and indigenous rights causes across the Amazon. The four of them had found a rhythm. Mornings often found David and Sina working together in the study, researching and planning. Afternoons might see him helping Amara in the garden or reviewing legal documents with Kira. Evenings were for family time, all four of them sharing meals and conversation. Navigating the romantic aspects had been a learning process. David had initially tried to treat all three women exactly the same, thinking that was fair. Kira had finally pulled him aside and explained that fairness didn't mean identical treatment. We're different people with different needs. Sina wants intellectual stimulation. Amara needs emotional connection. I value direct communication and shared goals. Love us for who we are, not as interchangeable parts. That advice had helped tremendously. David learned to read each woman's needs, to provide what they specifically wanted rather than what he thought they should want, and the women in turn were patient with his stumbles and generous with their guidance. The biggest challenge came when David's mother visited. He'd warned her, explained as much as he could over the phone, but nothing quite prepared her for the reality of meeting her son's three partners. She'd flown to Brazil, taken a small plane to the nearest town, and then endured a jeep ride and boat trip to reach the house. David met her at the dock, nervous as a teenager. Mom, I know this is unusual. His mother, a practical woman who'd raised him alone after his father died, just hugged him tight. You look happy. Healthier than I've seen you in years. That's what matters. The three women had prepared for days for this meeting. They'd cooked traditional foods from both cultures, cleaned the house until it shone, and rehearsed what they wanted to say. When David brought his mother into the house, all three stood waiting, visibly nervous. His mother looked at each of them carefully. Then she smiled. "Well, you're all certainly beautiful, but more importantly, my son's letters have been full of praise for your intelligence, your kindness, and your strength. So let's sit down, have some tea, and you can tell me about yourselves." The next 3 days were a revelation. David's mother, once she got over her initial surprise, genuinely enjoyed the women's company. She laughed at Sina's observations about human behavior. She swapped recipes with Amara, fascinated by the medicinal properties of jungle.